This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Monisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on the Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Jovanni, here with Monisha. Hey, Monisha.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us today, and let's get to it. It has been 2 months and 14 days since the U.S. President Donald Trump ordered an unprovoked military attack on Venezuela and kidnapping its sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, First Lady and First Combatant, and National Assembly member, Celia Flores. The surprise assault involved over 100 aircraft, drones, and helicopters bombing military barracks, power stations, medical centers, and civilian homes, killing over 100 people and creating cover for American Special Operations Forces to abduct Maduro and Flores from the presidential residence. They were then flown out of the country and paraded through the streets of New York City like trophies from the Roman era, before being placed in a Brooklyn jail, where Maduro now faces a show trial on frivolous charges in blatant breach of diplomatic immunity. After his abduction, New York courts swiftly dropped charges alleging Maduro as the kingpin and cartel leader of a non-existent drug cartel, the principal pretext for the abduction, along with other charges, while retaining only weapons possessions count. Yet months later, rather than decapitating Venezuela's government, Washington's act of geopolitical shock and awe has backfired. The Bolivarian movement endures under Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, and the spectacle of a captured head of state has transformed Maduro into a Latin American Mandela, a lasting symbol of resistance against imperial overreach, whose image now galvanizing solidarity protests across the globe. Perhaps the most astonishing thing has been the deafening silence over the egregious violence of sovereignty across Latin America, with the exception of 2 major countries, Colombia and Mexico, along with Cuba, Nicaragua, and smaller Antille Caribbean nations, and that of the diaspora living in the U.S., especially since many had clung to the Latin American unity theme when Bad Bunny Super Bowl halftime show was taken as an affront to Trump's anti-Latino policies, ICE terror across the country. But let's revisit January 3rd. What has happened since? How does what happened to Venezuela fit into the American grand political chessboard? Here we are today with our guest, Leonardo Flores. Leonardo Flores is a co-pink Latin American campaign spokesperson and coalition organizer, a Venezuela American political analyst and activist with a degree in philosophy. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains close ties to the social movements that have transformed the country over the past 27 years. He served as a media analyst and later policy advisor at the Venezuela Embassy in Washington, D.C., before joining Code Pink as Latin American campaign coordinator from 2019 to 2022. He's a founding member of the Venezuelan Solidarity Network and has worked as a consultant with the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. Welcome to the show, Leonardo. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here with y'all.
It's so good to have you here with us. And like I said, I've been following your work for a while, and I'm happy to have you here and speaking to you, for the first time, finally speaking with you. Yeah, tell us what's been happening in Venezuela since the abduction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say about the abduction and really about the attack in general on January 3rd was that the U.S. had a military victory, we could say, but it wasn't a complete victory. It wasn't a political victory because they were looking for a little bit more than just kidnapping President Maduro and First Combatant Cilia Flores, right? They were trying to either spark a coup or spark some sort of military rebellion, start a civil war in the country. I mean, they really wanted a transition government in place, and they wanted to clear the path for basically Venezuela's fascists to take over, led by Maria Corina Machado. But that didn't happen. And it became clear within hours of the attack that it wasn't going to happen, right? Because we're talking about this blockade, the U.S. deployment to the Caribbean began in August, right? So they had been basically surrounding Venezuela since August. And at first, my analysis of it up until kind of December was that it was really psychological warfare. It was psychological warfare aimed at breaking down the Venezuelan military, at causing some sort of schism, to have them uprise against the Maduro government and create some sort of civil war that the U.S. can then intervene in. And none of that happened. The Bolivarian revolution stayed strong, and it's still strong today. I think there's been a lot of speculation, especially in the media. And unfortunately, that's kind of bleeding into some of the left and solidarity groups about an alleged betrayal within the revolution. But within Venezuela, the movements aren't seeing that. The movements are firmly behind Delcy Rodríguez, the acting president. And they've been mobilizing constantly since January 3rd, calling for the return of President Maduro, calling for the United States to stop its hybrid war against Venezuela.
Yeah, like you, I also saw this whole buildup, this whole intimidation tactic, looking for for a break, within in the inner circles of the government, perhaps like a palace revolt or something like that, a palace coup or something like that. That's what I was thinking, that's what they were going for. Then they escalated they did an escalation. They did an escalating the tactic of starting to bomb those little speedboats and whatnot off the coast of Venezuela, Trinidad, and all these other places off of Colombia as well. All the extrajudicial killing of people who they didn't know who they were killing. They were just killing people left and right. And I thought that also was to amp the pressure on the government, and not only the government, but not the government per se, but the people around them, right? To, like I said, do a palace coup and let the invaders in. But yeah, when all that fails, that's when they went for the shock and awe, and and did what happened on January 3rd with the abduction of the president. So
Yeah,
go
I'm
ahead.
glad you mentioned those strikes, right? Because I think there's been something like 45 airstrikes right now against these boats, and like you said, we don't know who the victims are.
Mm.
They've certainly, we have no reason to believe that they're actually drug traffickers, because there's been a couple of cases where we had survivors and they were sent to Ecuador and Colombia respectively, and then they were immediately released by those authorities because they had no charges against them. And then in terms of the escalation, I said that in December, my analysis changed the situation a bit. And that was because the U.S., in late November, the USS Gerald Ford arrived off the coast of Venezuela. And then in December, something happened, which is that the U.S. started blockading Venezuelan oil. And
Mm.
so, we had all these reports of ships being seized by the United States, and the United States, Navy chasing ships across the world. I mean, I think the last one was caught a few weeks ago in the Indian Ocean, right? And then there was a so-called no-fly zone that the Trump administration attempted to impose. And at that point, it seemed clear to me that there was going to be an attack imminent. And that's despite the fact that Maduro and Trump had held this telephone conversation that had apparently gone well. And there was this idea really floating around that the negotiations were ongoing.
Mhm.
And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what scares me about what's happening in Cuba right now is that we're seeing the same sort of thing happen, right? The same sort of pattern develop, where there's talk of negotiations, where in the media they're now saying that that the Trump administration is insisting that President Diaz-Canel resign or step aside somehow, and then negotiations can continue. And the same thing happened with Venezuela. There was media reports floating around back in September about, well, if Maduro steps down, the U.S. will lift sanctions and will recognize the vice president. And nobody was really thinking that was a possibility, because why would he step down? He's the president, he's elected. But then that's what the United States kind of ended up doing.
What exactly are the charges against Maduro?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you're right. They dropped the most serious charge about the Cartel de los Soles, because it's a cartel that doesn't exist. Just a little bit more background on that. I went through, I think it was about 20 reports of this thing called the National Drug Threat Assessment. It's a yearly report put out by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. There was not a single reference to the Cartel de los Soles in 20 years of reports, and they have pages and pages about other cartels, especially ones in Mexico. On top of that, the actual name Cartel de los Soles comes from a CIA operation from the early 1990s. There's this great segment on 60 Minutes called The CIA's Cocaine, and they detail how the CIA was working with the Venezuelan National Guard at the time, and they called it the Cartel of the Sun, because the National Guard in Venezuela at the time had a big patch of the sun on their uniforms. And they were trying to allegedly infiltrate Pablo Escobar, the drug kingpin in Colombia, his cartel. And to do that, they were importing drugs from Colombia, funneling it through Venezuela, and sending it to the United States, millions of dollars. And so to me, it's kind of ridiculous, because at the time, Venezuela was a transit country for cocaine, for about 50% of the world's cocaine. By the time Maduro was kidnapped, Venezuela, it was a transit point for about 5% of the world's cocaine. Huge shift in policy by the Venezuelan government that's been really going after drug trafficking hard, and managed like a an incredible achievement, I would say, especially in the midst of a hybrid war, is to really cut down on cocaine trafficking. And yet the US used that as a pretext anyway. But going back to the charges, now the charges are conspiracy, which is really super nebulous, and owning machine guns, which is totally absurd. So yeah, you're right. It's going to be a show trial. The actual charges don't even matter because this is really about the United States punishing an adversary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when actually it was Chavez who kicked out the DEA. And once the DEA was sent home, that's when you start seeing an increase and decrease in narco trafficking through Venezuela after that. So I remember I was in the military. I remember when Chavez had a coup. When they had a coup against Chavez in '02, and then after that, I've been following Chavez ever since. And I remember when they see this, after Chavez sent the DA home, that's when they started doing a lot of raids in the frontiers against Colombia. I remember they seizing a submarine. It was a submarine that was off of the coast of Venezuela, full of also drugs on the way to the United States and whatnot, or wherever it was going. But yeah, you're right. After Venezuela went from 50% of being a transit country, right, of cocaine, 50% all the way down to 2%. And not only that, also when Ecuador also sent the DEA home packing, that's when their drug problems started decreasing as well. I mean, so there's a correlation here, so go ahead, Monisha, jump in whenever you can.
Thanks. Yeah. It's interesting too, because in 1999-ish, maybe a little bit earlier in the 90s, was when the narrative around, like, you had the whole drug war narrative going on since Plan Colombia, but in Vieques, where the U.S. had expropriated lands, kicked people out, I'm Viequense, and put this narrative of protectionism and all that other stuff to turn it basically into a floating military base, doing all but real war practice exercises, et cetera, et cetera. And when the people succeeded in kicking the Navy out, not completely, but mostly, in like 2003, just prior to that, they were running a narrative to get public support to install a relocatable over-the-horizon radar system pointed at Venezuela, Colombia, like pointed at our neighbors to catch drug traffickers, was the narrative that they were running in press and media and all that stuff. And yet in Puerto Rico, the drug trade is monumental. Murders happen constantly. Like when I was living in Vieques, there were massacres happening all the time. Innocent people were getting killed because of drug families at war with each other and all that stuff. And so to hear now that they're still running this war on drugs narrative all these years, it's like the same old playbook and people still fall for it. But what I'm curious about is, how are you seeing the U.S. justify its supposed jurisdiction over a sovereign state and a sovereign head of state? How are you seeing that play out in international media? I know the U.S. is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, which of course speaks volumes on its own. But in terms of that, like, narrative warfare specifically, how is the U.S. in your analysis justifying this thing that they're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the justification changed, and I'll go into that a little bit. But the initial justification was, as you said, narco-terror, right? Which is this kind of very nebulous term. What does it really mean? Anything can now be narco-terror. I mean, it's, a couple of guys driving a car in Southeast DC with a pound of marijuana. Are they narco-terrorists? I mean, the United States government might say so, and they might shoot them and they might kill them. And they've been doing that to Black people in this country for ages, right? So it's a term that actually began in Peru in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, this nebulous term of narco-terror. Then it spread kind of north from there. So internationally, that's what the U.S. has been using for at first to justify the attack on Venezuela, or the aggression on Venezuela, because this was prior to the attack, right? I would say that the U.S. doesn't really care about sovereignty other than its own sovereignty. So those arguments tend to fall very flat with U.S. diplomats, because they know that, their basic philosophy is might makes right. And we're seeing that play out basically on a daily basis with the Trump administration, where they can seemingly justify any atrocity if they're going after so-called terrorists. And any atrocities is somehow pitched as self-defense. In fact, in the first press conference that Trump gave about the attack on Venezuela, he framed it as self-defense, which is totally absurd. Trump was saying that Venezuela was flooding the streets of the United States with criminals and with cocaine. Neither of those were true. In fact, I think at the time in December, there were some 3,000 or so Venezuelans who'd been deported from the United States back to Venezuela, and maybe 2 of them had criminal records. So, that criminalization of migrants, which was another justification, was proven to be completely false, right? But something really curious happened in about, I want to say, a week to 10 days before January 3rd, was that suddenly the narrative shifted in the media and within the Trump administration. And they stopped talking about narco-terror and about drugs, and they started talking about Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. And that coincided with a visit in late December, early January of Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House. And then within days, this attack happens. So they totally kind of flipped the script to talk about Iran in the context of Venezuela, which was really an extremist right-wing talking point that's been floating around for like the past 25 years almost, but has never really been taken seriously by the policy establishment in Washington, because they know that although Iran and Venezuela have very deep ties in terms of economics and politically, socially, and those ties date back to the founding of OPEC, the oil-producing exporting countries. But those ties, even the military ties, Venezuela doesn't have any sort of military capacity to threaten the United States. So they were kind of trying to cast Venezuela in this light as supporting these quote unquote terrorist regimes. And that's when the attack happens.
That makes total sense. And I think it's interesting too, when you brought up the timing of the narrative shift around Venezuela, the attack on Venezuela, and how that narrative shifted over toward Iran. And so the U.S. likes to play a long game, and it has been playing a long game in Latin America, as we know, just as it's been playing a long game in, I don't want to say the Middle East because that's a colonial term, in the Levant, in that region. And of course, everything the U.S. does centers on oil, controlling resources, controlling finite materials, raw materials, etc., controlling labor, etc. How interesting that the first step was to take this action against Venezuela, attempt essentially to control Venezuela's oil right before this attack on Iran, which is disrupting the transport of oil from those OPEC nations to the rest of the world, essentially. So in my mind, I think about how convenient it would be for the US, who wants to remain a superpower and have basically control of the world's market in all aspects, try to take over the largest oil reserves in the world in Venezuela just before disrupting the flow of exchange for oil across the world on the other side of the world. I don't know. That's just something I find fishy. And especially with the false state of Israel's involvement in all of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it, well, this attack and then the subsequent attack on Iran, part of the attack on Venezuela was meant to stabilize oil prices in anticipation of a prolonged war with Iran. And maybe not even a prolonged war, but anticipation of a war with Iran that would see oil prices skyrocket as we're seeing right now. And the thing about what's happening between the United States and Venezuela, the United States isn't controlling Venezuela's oil production right now, but they are controlling Venezuela's trade in oil, right? And so all of Venezuela's oil trade, and this is starting to change because even as of March 17th, the Trump administration is now saying that they're going to start lifting some sanctions on foreign oil companies on Venezuela, so that foreign oil companies can do business with Venezuela. But the U.S. is still obviously blockading the country. There's still a massive deployment of the Navy off Venezuela's shores, and they're controlling the trade, and they're saying that Venezuela has to trade through 2 U.S. companies, I'm blanking on their names right now, but one of those companies is a big supporter of the Trump administration. They've given money to his political action committee. The other company was flagged for corrupt practices. So these are kind of really nasty actors that Venezuela has to deal with now. So there is this control of oil, but the thing is that the United States has been waging economic warfare on Venezuela since at least 2015. And then when Trump comes into office in 2017, he immediately starts oil sanctions. And these sanctions got progressively worse until around August of 2019, when they imposed what the Wall Street Journal characterized as a total economic embargo of Venezuela, specifically of the Venezuelan government. So in that interim, Venezuela's oil production cratered, right? And their oil revenues fell something like 99%. This happened over a period of 2 or 3 years. And that led to a massive economic crisis. It led to mass migration as well. But Venezuela had been able to, starting roughly in 2021, to overcome those sanctions and to restart its oil supply. So by November of last year, before the blockade of oil from the United States on Venezuela, Venezuela was producing roughly 1.2 million barrels of oil. It had had 18, 19 straight quarters of economic growth. The sensation was that Venezuela had hit rock bottom economically, and that they had found a way because they had found a way to overcome the sanctions. And so now Trump comes in and blockades the oil and says you can only trade oil through these companies. And the thing is, Venezuela right now isn't producing as much oil as it was 4 months ago. And so Trump is kind of scrambling because he's seeing this and he's thinking, wait, this is really backfiring, because the whole point of going after Venezuela first was to stabilize the oil market, but now they're producing less than they were. And so that's why we're seeing all these news stories about Trump considering a more lifting of sanctions and offering kind of partial sanctions relief every 2 weeks or so. And he frames it as, oh, it's because Delcy, what he calls the acting President Rodríguez, it's because Delcy's so great and we're working so closely together. But no, it's because his policies have failed. And because Venezuela, which was supposed to produce oil really rapidly if the US came in, and that's not happening because of the US sanctions that are still in place. In fact, there was a really weird meeting in DC within a week of the attack on Venezuela, where Trump invited the heads of several transnational oil companies, and they had this big open press conference with them. And he asked, well, what's holding you back from investing in Venezuela? And one of the oil companies was very clear. They were like, well, US sanctions are. And so, without these sanctions, Venezuela would be producing a lot more oil, and ironically, the US would be better off because the oil market would be even more stable. And so the United States really finds itself with a problem here. And that really kind of undercuts this argument that Venezuela has become a colony of the United States in some way, because it's clear that it's the US policy against Venezuela, it's economic warfare, which is harming not just Venezuela, but is now beginning to harm the United States as well.
So what was this hydrocarbon law that just passed recently?
Yeah, so Venezuela has a hydrocarbon law that they amended in 2006 that really kind of renationalized the oil industry, made it so that PDVSA, which is the state-owned oil company, had to have a majority share in any sort of joint project. But because of this economic warfare, because of all these sanctions on the oil industry that really destroyed the industry, Venezuela had to find a way to, first of all, not just produce oil, but ship oil in ways that could not be detected by the United States, that is, by evading these sanctions. And so they passed an anti-blockade law a few years back, and that was really fundamental in helping Venezuela's economic recovery that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago, right? And now that we have this new kind of really tense relationship with the United States, where they're pretending to be friends of Venezuela now, Venezuela understands that, first of all, its capacity to act against this U.S. aggression is very limited. But on the flip side of the coin is that Venezuela really needs and wants investment in its oil sector, because it's been underinvested, not from any fault of the Venezuelans, but because of these economic sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States against the Venezuelan oil industry. So this new hydrocarbon law, what it does is that it eases it basically gives better returns to oil companies, particularly what the ones who invest in what are known as what the Venezuelans call green fields, which are basically undeveloped oil fields that have known reserves in them. And it's a way to attract investment and to boost production. It's not going to give kind of immediate benefits in the short term, but in the medium and long terms, it should boost production in Venezuela. And there's been a lot of controversy about this law, mostly internationally rather than in Venezuela, because internally, domestically, I think there was an understanding that something had to be done. And you can't be kind of dogmatic about some of these laws. Yes, it was a key law that Hugo Chavez managed to pass in 2006. But if he were still alive with us today, he was someone who was understood pragmatism not as an ideology, but as something that you employ depending on the conditions and depending on the conjuncture, right? And so he would see this conjuncture and say, look, the reality is that the United States still is blocking us from obtaining the necessary investment that we need. And if we adjust our laws, we can get some of that investment. And that's ultimately going to be a good thing for the Venezuelan people as more oil money is set to flow into the country.
You just mentioned Chavez. So basically, Maduro came to power in 2014, and the United States have never recognized his presidency. He's been elected 3 times, and the United States have always contested all 3 elections. And before that, they've always been slow to recognize Chavez's electoral victory as well. When they had no other, when everybody else recognized, they were like kind of last ones to recognize, right? But yet the U.S. is quick to hold on and recognize and give credence to all of the accusations of the Venezuelan right. And recently, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, I think for the first time, the Trump administration recognized Delcy's presidency, right? What do you make of all this, and how does this affect, one thing, how is this going to affect Chavismo now and all these gains? And where is the Washington-backed opposition in all this?
Yeah, and let me just kind of backtrack a little bit just to give folks a bit more context, because I think it's kind of important and there are some really interesting parallels, right? So Chavez in 2002, he faced a coup that was backed by the US, right? And there were a couple of main reasons why that happened. There was a geopolitical reason, and then there was oil, right? So right before that coup, Chavez was trying to wrest control away of the state-owned oil company from these executives who basically belonged to the Venezuelan oligarchy that had basically looted the company and kept all the profits for themselves. And then he was trying to make it more state-run. Also at that time, after the attacks on September 11th, Chavez was saying, we shouldn't fight terror with terror, warning the United States that, its actions in Afghanistan could backfire. And I think maybe a couple of weeks after the U.S. began its war in Afghanistan, Chavez was on TV showing pictures of some of the dead children that were killed in Afghanistan from U.S. bombs. And so this really put Chavez kind of in the crosshairs of Washington, and that led to the coup against him in 2002. Then Maduro gets into office after Chavez passes away in 2013. He is, as you said, he won the elections, and Washington didn't not only fail to recognize him, but then they absurdly claimed at one point that, we don't recognize elections in other countries, which is a joke because they do that all the time, right? But this failure to recognize Maduro, the immediate aftermath was that there was political violence in Venezuela. About a dozen people died in the aftermath of those elections, and that hadn't really happened in the country in a long time, that sort of political violence. After that, there's a 2 CIA-backed color revolution attempts in Venezuela, 2014, 2017. In 2018, there was an attempted assassination attempt on Maduro by drones, leading with C4. 2019 was the whole Guaido thing. 2020 was the mercenary attempted invasion, when Juan Guaido contracted some US-based mercenaries to invade the country and killed Chavista leaders, but they were captured almost immediately. So it's been kind of, and I just mentioned all this because to show that it hasn't been, it wasn't just the attack on January 3rd. This is something that's going back 25 years, right? These attacks on Venezuela, the US attempts to control Venezuela, to enforce regime change in Venezuela. Now going to Delcy Rodríguez, her being recognized by the Trump administration, and they've done it in several ways. The Trump himself had said it, the State Department said it, and now the U.S. courts are saying that hers is the legitimate government of Venezuela. It's really important for many reasons. One, it allows Venezuela to defend itself in U.S. courts, whereas before the people representing Venezuela were the fascists, basically. This has been the case since 2019. And Venezuela has a lot of pending court cases because one of the effects of the economic war was that Venezuela couldn't pay back its debts because it wasn't allowed to take on new debts or to refinance those debts or renegotiate those terms. And so you have a lot of creditors going after Venezuelan assets in the United States, like, for example, Citgo, which belongs to Venezuela, and maybe sue lost depending on how the court system plays out. So this recognition of Delcy Rodríguez is incredibly important. And there's also the establishment of embassies again for the first time since 2019. And that's really going to help. From my perspective, I think it's fantastic because it's really going to help a lot of the Venezuelans who find themselves in ICE detention, because these are people who don't have consular access because Venezuela does not have a consulate in the US, and it's going to open soon. And that's going to really provide a lot of relief, I think, for families, and it's going to lead to family reunifications of people who were separated by ICE. So I think what we're seeing now is a very positive sign from a Venezuelan perspective of this reestablishment of relations. And on the flip side of that, we know what that means, right? It means that the CIA is going to be operating directly in Caracas again. And I think that's something that the Venezuelans can live with because they've been able to, for the most part, overcome all of these CIA operations with the very notable exception of January 3rd.
Yes, yeah. Where are these what's his name? The opposition in Madrid, and where are they at now? You know, this what's his name? Leopoldo
Leopoldo Lopez.
Lopez, Karina Machado. Where are these people at now?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because one of the things that the Trump administration realized, or like in the day, basically the same day of January 3rd, when nothing happened in Venezuela internally in terms of, coup, no civil war, was that Maria Corina Machado, who is like basically anointed as the new opposition leader in Venezuela, was that she has no power in the country. And Trump himself said she has no respect in the country. And so she's been really completely sidelined, it became really embarrassing, and she became the butt of jokes in Venezuela because this is a woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize despite calling for sanctions against Venezuela, calling for an invasion of Venezuela, not saying a single thing when those boats were being attacked, not saying a single thing when Venezuela was bombed, other than to praise the Trump administration. So it's basically this warmonger got the Nobel Peace Prize, and then she went to Washington and gave it to her master, which is Donald Trump, with the hopes that, oh, well, then that's going to change his mind and he's going to start pushing for Maria Corina Machado to return to Venezuela so she can take power. And the thing is, that's not happening. And if anything, what we've learned is that the Trump administration doesn't want Maria Corina Machado back in Venezuela because that would possibly upset the oil trade between Venezuela and the United States. So he wants to keep her out of the country. She's right now, I think she was just in Chile for the inauguration of their new president cast. Leopoldo Lopez is in Madrid, as far as I know. They're still conspiring against Venezuela, but they've been very sidelined. And now we're seeing kind of new leadership within Venezuela's more moderate opposition. And I say moderate not in the sense that, a lot of these people are neoliberals and they're neocons, and we wouldn't really call them moderate in any other context, but they're moderate because they're okay with engaging in dialogue with the Venezuelan government, and they don't want a war in Venezuela, a civil war, and that makes them moderate. And so these people have now kind of found a new wind, right? In the sense that like they have seen that the Venezuelan fascists, who have enjoyed not just the political support in the United States for the past 27 years, but their logistical and financial support, almost to the exclusion of all of those moderates. The NED, USAID, they fund Maria Corina Machado's NGO, Sumate. They funded Leopoldo Lopez for many years. And now these people, the more moderate opposition in Venezuela, is finding that they have much more space to operate. In fact, Venezuela just passed this the National Assembly, and the president approved it, this amnesty law, which goes back to the 2002 coup, and which really contemplates amnesty for a lot of kind of political crimes. One of the things that it does not contemplate amnesty for is for the people who either backed, supported, or called for an invasion of the United States, the sanctions, economic warfare, or coup. And so basically that includes Maria Corina Machado and Leopoldo Lopez and a lot of their operators, but some of the more kind of other people in Venezuela who may have taken part in some of the political violence of the past 20 years. Now they're being released from prison, and there's really in Venezuela this new spirit of reconciliation, because one of the things that January 3rd attack did was unite the country in a really interesting way. That people who hate Chavismo, who hate Maduro, were like, no, this is insane. We don't want our country bombed. We understand what happens when U.S. bombs fall. This is not what we want. We want a different path. And so the government of Delcy Rodríguez, and really, this is really following Maduro, because in the weeks before Maduro was kidnapped, he had also given amnesty to about, I think it was 100 or so people who he released from jail. And so this new spirit of reconciliation has taken over in Venezuela, and I think there's a really interesting project of peace building going on internally in the country.
Yeah, indeed. I was always taken aback from with this happening, ICE raids and all that, right? And this, anybody was celebrating, when Bad Bunny. I'm going into the culture pop, pop culture now. Bad Bunny getting these awards at the Grammys, I believe they were, and then the halftime show, and then there was this euphoria about Latin American unity, and I think he started the halftime show with a guy in front and dressed like a jíbaro, saying that que lindo ser Latino, and that's pretty much like an affront toward these anti-Latino policies here in the United States and this ICE raids and stuff like that. Yeah, everybody been silenced about what's happening in Cuba right now, trying to strangle Cuba to submission, and what happened in Venezuela with the all the Latinos here. What happened in Venezuela on January 3rd. In fact, actually, I went to bed that day on January 3rd, that morning, seeing that raid happening, right? People were posting videos on Telegram about the whole bombing in Venezuela and stuff like that. And the next morning, I see all these texts, all these on my social media, all these people celebrating, the Venezuelans celebrating. And some of my friends, my social media friends, most of them were, Puerto Ricans and stuff like that, or Dominicans, and whatnot, celebrating with them, saying, posting stuff, congratulations to our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, blah, blah, this and that, blah, so this and that. And at the same time, I was seeing, when I started going through other people I follow, I started seeing this huge mobilization of Venezuelans in Venezuela coming out in droves, in thousands, 100,000, talking about, we want our president back, So there were like two different Venezuelans that we're seeing here. There's the ones in the diaspora, the one in Madrid, the one in South Florida, and the ones in Argentina. And then the ones there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that speaks a little bit to the polarization of Venezuela. And honestly, it's been really difficult. It's really difficult to talk to a Venezuelan in the United States, also a Venezuelan, because I understand that a lot of these people, especially the ones who migrated, say before 2020-ish, come from Venezuela's rich families, upper middle class, higher. They tend to be whiter. They tend to have a lot more money than the average Venezuelan, and they have been basically co-opted, or not even co-opted necessarily, because some of them are just outright fascists. And they have really contributed to this demonization of Venezuela, because they're the ones saying, oh, there's no democracy in Venezuela. Oh, there's violations of human rights. Oh, the Maduro government isn't doing anything right. But then when you analyze it, it's like, oh, wait, that's not the case at all. In fact, the biggest threat to Venezuela and the biggest violation of human rights in Venezuela isn't caused by the Venezuelan government. It's caused by the U.S. economic warfare against Venezuela that is crippling the nation's healthcare system, its social safety net, its education system, and so on. And so then when more Venezuelans, kind of the working class, started coming to the US in 2021, it was kind of an interesting dynamic, because they had first moved to other countries in Latin America. They made some money. They came back to Venezuela, and then they took on the trek to the United States, which is, if you go by land, they think people might have no idea how expensive it is, right? We're talking $10,000 minimum to travel from Venezuela to the United States by land. It costs a lot of money. You have to pay off a lot of organized crime syndicates that smuggle you through various countries, that smuggle you through the Darien Gap. And the Venezuelan far right seem to be making money off this. And not only that, when they arrived in Venezuela, it was the far right that started this criminalization of Venezuelan migrants. And so it's really kind of sad how the Venezuelan diaspora has been acting towards not just the country, but towards their fellow countrymen and women, demonizing them and causing a lot of chaos. And so, yeah, I understand that they were happy on January 3rd, because that's what they've been working towards, is to destroy the Bolivarian revolution in some way. But they're not that happy now. And, we don't see them cheering now. And that's because they understand that there was no coup in Venezuela, that their own leaders have been totally sidelined, and that they don't have as much influence within the United States as they thought they did.
Just want to jump in and do a quick time check. I know Jovanni has to leave, Leonardo, how much time do you have left? Do you want to continue? Do you want to close now?
I mean, however long you all need, I'm flex in terms of time.
Okay.
I know you wanted to talk about the international stuff that we haven't really gotten to, like the more Latin America, Caribbean in general stuff.
Jovanni, is there anything specific that you want asked in that?
Yeah.
Here?
Can you say a little bit about this whole Shield of the Americas we just talked about now? The Shield of the Americas also, do you perceive that as a Condor 2.0, Plan Condor 2.0? And for people to know what Plan Condor was back in the 70s and 80s, where CIA pretty much and organized the most brutal dictators, in Latin America, pretty much to pursue leftist organizers and left leaders and whatnot, trade leaders and stuff like that, and they just cleans them out. So do you foresee this to be a type of Plan Condor 2.0? And also, do you have any information of this Isaac Accord with Israel that they're talking about, just like the Abraham Accord?
Yeah, in terms of the Shield of the Americas, I think you're absolutely right that it is looking like it's going to be a Plan Condor 2.0. They're framing it again in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of narco-terrorism, and in terms of security. But I think what we're going to see is basically campesinos being bombed, having their crops fumigated in order to be displaced from their lands for U.S. corporations. And really, this is kind of the culmination of, I would say, maybe the last 12, 13 years of U.S. foreign policy. Between when the pink tide came into power, 1999 through let's say 2013, the pink tide was in power. The pink tide referring to leftist and progressive governments that were in power in many, many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. There was an interesting dynamic going on, was that the entire region was pushing towards more regional integration, and we saw multilateral organizations like CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, Mercosur, the Common Market of the South, was strengthened. We saw PetroCaribe, which is this Venezuelan Cuban program aimed at helping people in the Caribbean overcome high energy prices. And that was really drawing the region together. And then the United States, the Bush administration didn't really pay too much attention to Latin America. I mean, they did some really nasty things at times, including the attempted coup against Chavez, but mostly their focus was in West Asia. The Obama administration in the first term, same thing. But in the second term, they really started focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean and trying to divide the region into kind of who's friends with the United States and who isn't. And now we're seeing those plans kind of culminate, because if that's the Shield of the Americas, it was basically the governments that are very much aligned with Trump. And there's like the fascists in Latin America and the Caribbean are very closely connected to Trumpism in the United States. And that's a phenomenon that we've been seeing for the last 9 years that keeps getting deeper and deeper. And so it was those countries that attended this Shield of the Americas. But there's been no counterbalance on the left. Yes, we have Cuba, we have Nicaragua, we have Venezuela. But the other kind of big countries, Mexico maybe being the exception, but even Colombia and Brazil, they haven't really taken a stance to challenge the United States in particularly significant ways. And we're seeing that with Cuba, right? Cuba right now is being starved of oil. Its people are really suffering. And Brazil hasn't done much of anything. Colombia hasn't done much of anything. And so there's no longer that left unity that used to exist in Latin America maybe 15 years ago. And at one point, that unity was almost bipartisan, because some of the creators of these institutions, these multilateral institutions that I mentioned, were from right-wing governments that wanted better regional integration for kind of market reasons, right? But the United States really put an end to that, and has really kind of caused a schism in Latin America between those who totally follow Trump and his point of view, and those who have a different point of view. And unfortunately, some of the bigger players in Latin America have been either silenced or bought out by the Trump administration.
Thank you for that. So this is going to be edited, and thank you, Henry, for editing this out and editing out my awkwardness. What do you think that means? What's the end goal of this meddling in our region?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump has laid it out pretty clearly, both in kind of the national security strategy and his so-called Monroe Doctrine, right? Which is that he really wants for the United States to be the main player in this entire hemisphere. And that to the Trump administration means not only sidelining Russia and China and Iran to the greatest extent possible, and really it's mostly about China because Russia and Iran don't have too much influence in Latin America. But it also means that controlling resources throughout the hemisphere for U.S. corporations, and that is really key. And when we look at the Monroe Doctrine, and we have to understand it as a tool of imperialism that's seeking to subjugate the entire hemisphere, and one of the main ways it subjugates is through this divisionism that I was just talking about, right? And so Latin America and the Caribbean have to find a way to come closer together. It was in 2014 that the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, declared the Caribbean and Latin America to be a zone of peace, meaning they didn't want warfare. They wanted all kind of political disagreements to be resolved through dialogue. And that was really a kind of a groundbreaking document to have this entire, almost an entire hemisphere be united in wanting peace and in wanting no foreign interference. And the United States at first was like playing nice with that. And they were like, oh, they didn't sign on, of course. And I'm not sure they were even invited to, but they accepted it. But meanwhile, they were working behind the scenes to undercut that. I think what we're seeing is, as the United States finds itself obviously still very much involved in West Asia, as we're seeing with this war in Iran, but in a different way, they're kind of trying to limit the losses of American empire, particularly when it comes to Chinese economic power. And one of the ways that they see being able to limit those losses is to control what they perceive to be their quote unquote backyard, right? Which is the rest of the Western hemisphere. And so I think that's the end game, is to ensure that they're the ones who have total control in Latin America and the Caribbean. I don't know that vision is going to survive the Trump administration. I'm not sure if whoever's next is going to really push that forward, because we're seeing a really interesting divide in foreign policy now between some Democrats and the Republicans, where usually they work in lockstep, especially when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, I'm kind of heartened because there's this thing called the New Good Neighbor policy that's being pushed by some progressive Democrats. And it really calls on the United States to engage in relations with its neighbors based on mutual understanding, dialogue, and respect, and basically the fundamentals of international law. And this is like an idea that has a lot of precedent, right? Because even when the Monroe Doctrine was first introduced 200 years ago, there was a lot of active resistance to that idea in Congress. There were a lot of people who wanted not U.S. domination of the entire region, but more regional integration and friendly relations. And so my message really is, we can't lose hope in the face of this onslaught by the United States, not just in West Asia, but in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have to understand that not only is there resistance going on throughout the global South to the United States, but there's resistance right here at home. And that the more we draw those connections between what imperialism means to the rest of the global South and what that same sort of militarism means to our communities right here at home, and how that $1 trillion Pentagon budget affects us every single day, whether it's through bad education, water that's undrinkable, or poor housing. Those are things that we could have. We could have dignified housing for everyone if the Pentagon budget was cut even just a little bit. And so drawing that connection is, to me, one of the fundamental roles I have as a peace activist, and to really open people's eyes to the fact that U.S. imperialism isn't just about killing Black and brown people overseas. It's killing Black and brown people right here at home, and the poor white working class as well.
I'm waiting for these fighter jets to stop doing what they're doing. They're just landing.
Wow, is that every day?
It was every day, constantly throughout the day and into the night and in the wee hours of the morning. And then what's interesting is the days and weeks leading up to the attack on Venezuela, the amount of F-35s coming and going was astronomical. It was constant. I see the flight line from my bedroom window. I cannot escape this noise or how it vibrates the house. I've said this a couple of times on the podcast already. People are probably sick of me complaining, but it's like this constantly. And it died down 2 days before the attack. They moved assets to different locations, but immediately after the attack, so many of them were returning here. So I was hearing them come back from doing that. And now, like you mentioned before, being concerned about Cuba, the way that movement of aircraft now has escalated in the last couple of days, subsequent to what you mentioned earlier about the US and Cuba having talks and how the pattern goes with this now. I'm also very concerned that this heightened movement of aircraft, now I'm seeing more Osprey coming and going like it used to be in the beginning before the attack on Venezuela. Definitely more F-35s, F-16s, attack helicopters. Seeing that movement again coinciding with this, what's happening in the geopolitical narrative sphere, makes me very nervous that and especially with the now Cuba being completely blacked out. That's rather convenient.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah, exactly. And you're talking about having hope. Right now, I know that's hard for a lot of people. How do we hold on to that hope? Like you're mentioning resistance and a lot of these things that are visible to a lot of us. How can we keep that momentum going? And in your perspective, where do you see points of resistance being possible? Because here in Puerto Rico, I'll sideline with a story real quick. There have been protests consistently led by Mothers Against the War, Madres contra la Guerra, and also other groups here in PR attended. Like the numbers in each protest are shrinking, unfortunately, but we're not stopping. The protests happen in front of each base. So there are protests here regularly. I believe there's one coming up this month. And we're doing our best to speak out against this as Puerto Ricans and to demand that our government, which is a Trump government, Trump supporting government, unfortunately, where do you see those points of resistance kind of expanding and growing and getting stronger, keeping it peaceful resistance? And then I guess this is a two-part question, and that's my dog. He wants to go to bed. But the role of Puerto Rico in all of this too, as a colony, as basically a reactivated military base that these attacks are primarily being launched from. Being that we are a colony, is there a sense of connection within the peace activist world? I'm no longer a part of it really, but like, are people connecting the dots to the colonization of Puerto Rico and the military readiness of the U.S. to do all of this that it's doing in our region?
Yeah, I'll start with that second question first. I think people are connecting the dots. I'm a peace activist, and there's a couple of Puerto Rican organizations that have been really, really active, particularly in the last 6 months. I'll give a shout out to one, the Diaspora Collective, which is kind of a nationwide, where Puerto Rican folks from all over the country who have been very active and anti-imperialist. And they are bringing Puerto Rico into the conversation a lot. The thing is that it's really hard to bring any country into the conversation when the Trump administration just moves so quickly from topic to topic, right? And when our own attention spans shift so quickly. Immediately after January 3rd, the focus was all on Venezuela. And we had statements from organizations that had never really talked about Venezuela before. I'm thinking Move On put out a good statement. The ASL-CIO put out a good statement. And what happened about a week and a half later, Rachel Nicole Good was killed in Minnesota, Alex Preddy was killed in Minnesota, and everything exploded with ICE. So Venezuela was immediately, this topic shifted. Then a couple of weeks after that, it was all Greenland. And then it was Cuba, and then it was Iran, and now it's Cuba again and Iran. And so, with the Trump administration kind of pushing forward because they understand that they have to do something almost every week to serve as kind of a pressure valve, because the Trump administration is under immense pressure, particularly from the Epstein files, but for many, many reasons, right? And so that makes it difficult to keep any one country or Puerto Rico in the conversation. But certainly those of us, especially those who do Latin American solidarity, are always very quick to talk about Puerto Rico because it is a colony. And it's a colony that many people in the United States don't even realize it's a colony, right? And they don't really even know what to think about Puerto Rico. And so keeping that alive, keeping that discussion alive is really key, and especially drawing that connection you made, right? The Puerto Rico as a military base from which it's maybe attacking other countries. And now that we've seen the United States attack South American country for the first time ever, might it be, we see more of that in the future, particularly if this so-called shield of the Americas becomes kind of a drone war for Latin America and the Caribbean. Are the drones going to be leaving Puerto Rico? So absolutely, that's kind of a key issue that we have to continually bring up. I don't know that it's in the forefront of most peace activists' minds because of everything else that's going on, but it's certainly at the forefront of Latin America solidarity activists' minds, which I consider myself as well. And then in terms of hope, I think one of the things that does give me hope is this kind of the total reaction to the abuses of ICE and the human rights violations by ICE, because we've seen nationwide protests against ICE. We see people organizing at a very community level with, ICE Watch and so forth. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope, because in terms of ICE specifically, I think it's really, really easy to draw the connections between US imperialism and what's happening here at home, because ICE is really just a force to crack down on the migrants that the US is causing to come here in the first place, in certain respects. And there are other things that give me hope. Right now, I think the peace movement is taking a lot of flack because we haven't seen lots of people on the streets protesting against the war in Iran, because the protests have been really small. But then when we look at the polls, we see that this is really maybe the most unpopular war ever, especially for a war that has just begun. And so I think that speaks to the fact that the United States are sick of these endless wars. And really, that's one of the things that Trump was campaigned on, right? Is ending these endless wars, and his people bought it. His supporters bought it. And now we're seeing his own movement kind of start to break apart a little bit, especially around the edges. And you have high profile people like, I don't know, Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson really questioning the US war in Iran, especially the atrocity committed on the very first day when the US bombed a school, right? A girls' school. And so I think that sort of discourse, that sort of narrative, is going to become more prevalent as we get closer to the midterm elections in this country. And I'm not one that puts a lot of faith in the electoral system in this country, but it's what we have. And it's one of the ways we have to express our displeasure. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of protests too this summer. I think this summer is going to be as filled with protests as the Black Lives Matter protests of 2021. And particularly because we have the World Cup being held in the United States, and I'm part of a coalition, and Code Pink is part of a coalition that's calling for a boycott of the World Cup and calling for protests at the World Cup. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. And on top of that, you have this other kind of whole movement called the No Kings movement, which really isn't international. In the sense that they don't really talk about war much. And it's sometimes at some points, when the peace movement has tried to kind of inject itself into this No Kings scenario, sometimes they get rebuffed, and other times they're very welcome. But I think because the war in Iran is so popular, that they're going to have to expand what they're talking about to not just be no kings, but also no empire. And I think that moving that conversation forward is going to be a really key for the peace movement as a whole. And, hope, like you said, it is hard to come by in the United States, but there's just been so much grassroots organizing, and it may have started during the pandemic, even just with mutual aid networks that sprang up to help each other's neighbors because it became clear that our government wasn't going to do it for us. And these mutual aid networks have just grown, and they've become tighter, and they've expanded their focus. And so I think that's going to be kind of a vector through which peace might eventually be possible for us.
I wholeheartedly agree, and not just because I work in mutual aid now. I think, honestly, strategically, the value of mutual aid work and the capacity it lends, if mutual aid networks can be better supported and greater expanded, I think that would better equip the masses in the US to do and maintain a general strike. Because I think a lot of people don't participate in protest and don't participate in strikes because of a lack of support. You have a lot of people who have children, a lot of people who are ill, a lot of people who have different mobility needs that are unsupported most of the time. And then you have also the economic inaccessibility of traveling to protest locations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, and then when we consider like what are the barriers to general strikes, sustained general strikes? Like we can see historical examples of those being really powerful. And there have been many attempts. And I think being able to strengthen those mutual aid networks will absolutely make sustained general strike accessible and possible because people will have their basic needs met with those networks in place. And same with going out and doing mass protest. And I don't know, I have hope. That's what gives me hope. Mutual aid is what gives me the most hope. That and all of the educating that people are doing. And even though we don't like confrontation is necessary sometimes in terms of like confronting ideas, confronting people with facts, confronting people and disrupting false narratives. Like all of those things are so essential. So is there anything else that you want, anything that we haven't touched on yet that's really important to you that you want people to take home from this?
I think we've touched on most things. I just want to kind of reiterate what Cuba's going through because, we see a lot of in the media talk about humanitarian crisis in Cuba, but it's not a humanitarian crisis. It's a crime against humanity. It's a
Amen.
crime that's being imposed by the United States that's really starving Cuba of oil. And that means a lot, right? I mean, when we think of a country not being able to import oil, we might not draw the connection that Cuba, I think roughly 80% of its electricity comes from fossil fuels, burning oil to create electricity. We don't have oil, you have nationwide blackouts. A nationwide blackout means that hospitals don't have power. If a hospital doesn't have power, a patient on a dialysis machine is at risk of dying. And I think really when we look at this US warfare against Cuba, you also have to highlight the fact that the first victims, excuse me, when we look at the U.S. warfare against Cuba, I really have to highlight the fact that the first victims are children, right? In Cuba, child mortality, the number one cause of child mortality for kids 0 through 5 right now is cancer. And the really sad thing is that it's treatable cancer, but the Cubans can't get those medicines because of the U.S. blockade. And so it's a lot of killing without bombs that's going on in Cuba. And I would urge folks that if you can, travel to Cuba. If you can't travel to Cuba, find someone, an organization that is, and donate so that they can bring humanitarian aid to Cuba. And like you said, the last thing I would say is really political education is going to be so key right now because people are really desperate for answers to be able to analyze everything that's going on. And without that political education, we just leave it up. We just leave it up to kind of more mainstream sources. Then everything's going to continue on the same, and we're not going to be able to break free of imperialism of the U.S. war machine. But political education, like this podcast, is really key to that.
Right on. Thank you so much, Leonardo, for giving us your time tonight. And of course, whenever you have another opportunity to come back, I'm sure there's a lot more we can dive into, especially with Cuba, especially with not knowing what's going to happen next. But yeah, I echo that tremendously. I know I've been to Cuba multiple times, gone to a lot of the peace conferences there, I've been on delegations there, and crossed from Havana to Guantanamo and seen. And then that was during the droughts. Those were during Trump and Biden that I went. So it was after things thawed and then got cold again. But I actually owe Cuban doctors my life. And I owe Venezuela my life too, because I was an election observer in the 2020 elections, presidential elections in Venezuela, and got COVID. And I survived COVID because the Venezuelan government supported my life. They didn't allow me to go without health care. And that whole journey, I got to see really up close and personal and talk with folks in the hospital, in the COVID ward, and hear a bunch of different perspectives of why their daily lives were the way that they were. Not everyone shared the same opinion. And I mean, that's human nature, right? And especially when we don't see the arm of who's actually hurting us, we're going to lash out and blame whoever looks like they have power. And the Cuban doctors that were there in Venezuela gave me a treatment. And I'm about to cry, but the nurses, the Venezuelan nurses, as much as they were struggling, and the hospital didn't have an x-ray machine. They couldn't do a chest x-ray on me. They didn't have a lot of the things that they needed, and people were dying. Like, one of the ladies that I made friends with died on the unit because they didn't have access to what they needed to be able to treat her. So I definitely, my heart is with Venezuela. My heart is with Cuba, not just because of what their love and solidarity and knowledge and compassion did for me personally, but because also we're relatives and human beings. So yeah, if there's any Cubanos or Venezolanos, I love you all. Thank you for existing. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being who you are and sharing the love that only us Latin Americans have for each other and for the world. But yeah, Leonardo, do you have any way for people to follow you, to follow your work, and any other last words that you have for our listeners?
Well, first of all, I just really want to thank you for the invitation. It's been really a pleasure to have this conversation with you all. And those were really beautiful words that you just shared. And I echo them as well. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on X. It's at Leonardo ESA. I'm also an organizer with Code Pink, and I'm going to pitch an action that we're doing. If you go to www.codepink.org/actcuba, we have an action calling for the Senate to pass a war powers resolution on Cuba. The threat against Cuba right now is very real. It's a military threat, and we cannot underestimate it. And we've got to push our representatives, our senators, to take action. It might not be successful, but we still have to do it anyway to show them that there are people in the United States who do not want this war. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today.
Right on. All right. Well, thank you, Leonardo, again, for sharing your time, thoughts, and experience. And everybody at home that's listening, stay safe, stay healthy. Don't stop. Don't give up on hope. And we'll see you all the next time.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch.
We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.